All right, everyone, welcome. So throughout this course, we've really been digging into the what, the formulas, the models, the core mathematical principles of business. But today, we're making a pretty big shift. We're going to dive deep into the how. How do all these concepts that we've learned on paper actually get applied in the real, high-stakes, fast-moving world of business? This is where the theory truly gets put to the test.
So let's start with this question, because it's really at the heart of what we're doing today, and I bet it's on a lot of your minds as you start thinking about your careers. Look, it's one thing to calculate, say, the net present value of a project on an exam. You know how it works. We give you all the variables neatly laid out, the initial investment, the future cash flows, the discount rate, the project's lifespan, but it is a completely different world to be standing in front of a board of directors defending your recommendation to invest $20 million in a new product line. A world where you were the one who had to build the financial model from scratch, forecast those cash flows from messy, incomplete sales data, and justify the specific discount rate you chose based on very real, very uncertain market risks. That's the leap we're talking about.
And that really is the fundamental challenge, isn't it? How do you bridge that gap? How do you take that mastery of the formulas and make it a powerful tool in a high-pressure professional setting? It's all about making that transition from being a student who knows the theory to becoming a professional who can make intelligent, defensible decisions with it.
You see, unlike the clean, straightforward examples in a textbook, real business problems are almost never neat and tidy. The data you need might be missing, or it might be contradictory, or maybe it's just buried somewhere in a massive 100-page market research report. The problem itself might not even be clearly defined. For example, nobody's going to come to your desk and ask you to please calculate the optimal inventory level. No, they're going to come to you and say, hey, how do we cut our carrying costs without risking stockouts during our busiest holiday season? And the answer to that requires so much more than a formula. It requires a deep understanding of trade-offs, of risks, and of the overall strategic goals of the entire business. Your ability to navigate that kind of ambiguity, that's what's going to set you apart.
So how do we get you ready for that messy reality, but in a controlled academic space? Well, we have a specific tool designed for exactly this purpose, the Capstone Interactive Problem-Solving Session. Honestly, the best way to think about it is like a flight simulator, but for business decisions. It's a safe space where you can wrestle with all that complexity and even face the consequences of your choices, but in a low-stakes environment. That way, you're prepared and confident when the stakes are very, very real.
Now let's look closely at the wording on this slide because it's important. When we say complex problems, we're not just talking about problems that are mathematically difficult. We mean they're multi-layered, often with no single right answer. And notice the phrase tools and techniques, it's plural. That's absolutely crucial. You'll need to synthesize multiple concepts. For instance, you might use regression analysis on historical sales data to forecast future demand, then feed that forecast into a cost-volume-profit analysis to find your break-even point. And you wouldn't stop there. You'd then use sensitivity analysis to see how that break-even point shifts if your key assumptions, like your variable costs, turn out to be wrong. You see, each tool builds on the last to create a complete, robust picture.
Okay, so let's pull back the curtain and see what actually happens inside one of these sessions. We can break it all down into a clear, structured process. Think of this as the framework you're going to use to take a messy, real-world problem and systematically turn it into something you can manage and solve.
These are your 4 critical steps. First, you analyze the scenario. You have to identify the real objective, the constraints you're working with, the knowns, and perhaps most importantly, the unknowns. Then, step 2, you select your tools. Now, here's a very common mistake I see students make. They reach for the most complex, sophisticated model they know, thinking it will prove how much they've learned. But often, the opposite is true. Is a complex Black-Scholes option pricing model the right tool, or is a simpler decision tree actually better? Well, if you're pricing a standard financial option with clear inputs, sure, Black-Scholes is elegant. But if you're trying to value a strategic investment, like an R&D project with multiple go, no-go decision points over several years, a decision tree is far superior. Why? Because it visually maps out the choices and probabilities in a way that the entire management team can actually understand. Simplicity and clarity are virtues, because remember, a brilliant model that nobody on the team understands is a model that will never ever get approved. Your analysis has to be clear to the people who are signing the check.
And this brings us to what might be the most important point of all. Getting the right number is only half the battle. Defending your decision, telling the story behind the numbers, that's what makes your analysis truly powerful. For example, you would never just walk into a meeting and say, the economic order quantity is 500 units. No. You'd say,
Our analysis indicates that an optimal order quantity of 500 units will minimize our total inventory costs by finding the sweet spot between our ordering costs and our holding costs. Now, this model assumes stable demand. However, we've also run a sensitivity analysis which shows that even with a 20% fluctuation in that demand, this policy remains robust and it's projected to save the company an estimated $50,000 a year. You see the difference? That is the story. That is the analysis that builds confidence and actually drives action.
Let's just zoom out for a second and talk about why we put you through such an intensive process. I mean, this isn't just about getting a good grade on a final assignment. This is about building a professional skill set that has real, tangible, long-term benefits for your career, starting from your very first job interview.
This entire process is designed to create a very specific transformation. Before this session, you have theoretical knowledge. You can recite the formula for calculating a bond's yield to maturity, no problem. But after this, you have applied wisdom. You'll understand when to use yield to maturity, which is for an investor who plans to hold the bond all the way to the end, versus when it's more appropriate to use yield to call for a callable bond that the issuer is likely to redeem early, maybe because interest rates have dropped. You'll know which metric tells the more relevant story for a specific investment decision. And that is the difference between an intern and a full-fledged analyst.
Through this process, you are actively building the exact skills that hiring managers are desperately looking for. So when you're in that interview and they ask you, tell me about a time you used data to solve a complex problem, your experience from this session is going to be your answer. You'll be able to talk about how you made a decision based on data, not just a gut feeling, how you thought critically about your assumptions, and how you translated a complex quantitative analysis into a clear, persuasive business case. That's what gets you the job. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this final thought. This interactive session is so much more than a final assignment. It's the culmination of everything you've learned. It's your final dress rehearsal before the curtain goes up on your professional career. Every single case study you've analyzed, every formula you've memorized, it has all been in preparation for this moment and for everything that comes next. So you have to ask yourself, are you ready? Because the real world is waiting for your analysis.